in the age of social media, where there's all this misleading content online and we're having these real impacts on democratic functioning, on everyday decision making of all this misleading content, there's been a lot of new research on misinformation and on disinformation. And a lot of this research thinks about, well, what is misinformation and what is disinformation? And those aren't just academic questions. Those questions really matter because part of what people are trying to figure out is what are the types of content that we want to deplatform, or we want to not promote with our algorithms, or we want to reduce the amount getting to everyday users because it's misleading them. So what you see, and especially a few years ago, what you saw people settling on were a lot of definitions that labeled this content as false or misleading. So misinformation is false content shared without an intent to mislead. Disinformation is false content shared with an intent to mislead. Increasingly, though, there is recognition that content itself, that where the content alone is accurate, can be shared in ways that are highly misleading as false or inaccurate content. And so people are starting to sort of shift their focus away from things that are just themselves false and inaccurate into what things can be shared in what ways to mislead people. And realizing this, again, is really important. It's not just an academic matter, because if you set up a bunch of algorithms that are tuned to find false content and deplatform it, they might be missing the sharing of completely accurate, true, sometimes scientifically validated content and the way that is being used or unintentionally misleading people. So the talk is focusing on that. And what I start with is this question: say we have a lot of accurate content, things that are maybe real data drawn from the world, especially data created by scientists. What are the ways that that content might be curated, shaped, selected, parts pulled out, that would then mislead users who receive this curated information? So I'm talking about curation as misinformation. The talk I'm giving divides into two parts based on two academic research projects that I did. One is focused on what we might think of like unintentionally misleading curation, and it's looking specifically at science journalism. So if you look at science journalism, of course science journalists don't publish on every single thing that happens in science. There's just way too much. There's too much data. There's too much information. It would be impossible to share everything. And so they necessarily have to curate what they're going to share. They have to select out part of that body of data to talk about. And there's different ways this happens. And in the paper, we focus on two types of ways. So the first has to do with fairness, which is traditionally a norm in journalism. And it's usually often been a good norm. The idea is you can't just cherry pick things from one side of an issue to share when that issue is controversial. You have to share information from both sides of the issue. And usually that norm is codified into practice via something like an equal time rule. If you have two people on TV on opposing sides of an issue, they get equal time. Or if you have print, you have equal space for one side of an issue versus another side of an issue. The problem that arises when you do that with scientific content is that you can have controversies where there's a lot more evidence in support of one side than the other. Climate change being a classic example. So part of what we want to ask is, when science journalists curate information to make it fair in cases like climate change, how might that be misleading? The other thing we look at is more based less in journalistic norms, more based in incentives. So journalists get paid by getting people to read things. And so they have to create content that people like. And one of the most significant things that attracts people to content is novelty, extremity, and shock value. And that's why we get clickbaity headlines, because people want to read things that are exciting and novel and different. What that means is that you often see reporting in science that reports on extreme events or studies that are really different from the body of other studies in an area. So you have this incentive to curate towards the most extreme and surprising science. So what we do in this work is we build a model where we ask, okay, suppose you have a lot of data from the world. It has some sort of characteristic distribution, and people want to learn about that. They want to know how dangerous are COVID cases on average? How hot has it been on average across different cities in the world? How sweet are tomatoes on average? Anything that's a matter of fact. We ask if scientists share information from the world, data from the world in a fair way or in an extreme way. How does that shape the ultimate beliefs of the users? And what we find is that these kinds of curation end up distorting what people believe about the world. They often come to believe that the world is more variable than it really is, that the sort of average things happening are more extreme than they really are. Or in the case of fairness, the opposite. They think something like climate change isn't that extreme. It's more like what everyone thinks the sort of average event is. So we find that in this case, people who are trying to convey accurate information, they're doing it, in a not misleading way, they believe. People who are trying to learn accurate things about the world and completely accurate content can lead to a public who believe quite false things about how the world works. I also talk about a project where we look at more active intent to mislead type curation. And that project draws on historical things that happened in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, especially where big tobacco, in light of increasing evidence that tobacco products were dangerous, started trying to use science to mislead the public. And one way they did that was by sharing just curated samples of independent scientific data. And in doing that, they really took advantage of the fact that scientific data is probabilistic. It's equivocal sometimes. If you test a whole population of people and smoking does cause cancer, your study may or may not show that smoking causes cancer because of the way probabilities work. And so what they would do is share information like 9 studies find no link between tobacco and cancer, and they wouldn't share information 50 other studies did find a link between tobacco and cancer. So this is a kind of cherry picking. And what we do in our model is we suppose we have a community of scientists, they're drawing independent, accurate data from some distribution, and then they're sharing that with the public. But we also assume there's some kind of propagandist who's selecting just that data that's misleading, accidentally, spuriously misleading, and sharing that with the public as well. And we find that without this propagandist, the public develops accurate beliefs, and then we add the propagandist, and often just that sharing of the sort of independent scientific data can completely mislead the learners. So this is another way in which curation can create a public who is entirely misled on some issue. In this case, they believe the full opposite of what is true. They end up thinking tobacco is totally safe when it's totally dangerous. So these are 2 examples of how curation can be misleading. I also talk a little bit about 1/3 example, which is that people can share accurate data in a way that ends up being causally confusing, where there is some important link between a cause and effect. Tobacco causes cancer. And then people purposely share other true causal information, like asbestos causes cancer. And so the people who get this information end up believing a true thing about asbestos, but the reason it's misleading is that they end up sort of decreasing their belief in this causal link about tobacco. You see the same thing happening with climate change. People share distracting information about, sunspots or whatever. So what we see is this doesn't sort of cover the whole set of ways in which curation can mislead, but we see these very realistic kinds of examples of how it can do so. And I think what this tells us in the end is that we ought to be putting curation more front and center when we're thinking about things like social media algorithms, misleading online content, how we define and think about things like misinformation and disinformation. It's not the only thing, but it should be an important part of the picture when we're trying to shape content so that people develop accurate beliefs about the world.